Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. On today's show, I will be featuring Andrew Johnson about his new book on UFOs. Just to let you know that tickets for the 2020 Rich Planet UK tour are available from richplanet.net. I'll be visiting 12 venues throughout the UK. I'll be putting out details of topics to be discussed in due course. Two people who have investigated the alien abduction phenomenon are Dr. Carla Turner and Dr. Roger Leir. So do you just want to tell us about Dr. Carla Turner first?
Yes, she's written 3 books which I think are worth reading. You can get them as PDFs. Sadly, she died in the late 90s, I think, died of cancer. But her books have a sort of interesting set of accounts of abductions which took place in the 1980s, which she was directly involved with, as were her family. And she became quite suspicious about this talk of these aliens being, enlightened beings who are here to help us and this sort of thing, because as can be seen, many of the accounts are quite abusive to people and very intrusive. And that was her experience too. And her books are called Into the Fringe, Masquerade of Angels, and Taken. And you can read those books. And I think she doesn't come to any specific conclusions herself, other than that these experiences were unpleasant. And she found that what the alien said was contradictory and deceptive. And so she didn't think that this was an enlightened group that was operating. And I think she started to investigate that this was some type of psychological operation that was going on.
Right.
And she even talks about, one of the things I mentioned in my book was there's one particular case where she seems to have found that there was some type of virtual reality system in use in creating this abduction experience, which she describes, I think, in the Taken book. So people might want to read the reference that I've made to that.
So she believes that the aliens are either deceptive or they're not aliens.
Correct.
It's human beings being doubly deceptive.
Yes.
Because they're deceiving someone about aliens and about what the aliens are, the message that they're given to.
Yeah, that's basically my interpretation of what's in her books, yes.
And Roger Leir, he's removed foreign objects from people's bodies that connect to the nervous system, implants.
Right.
And it's assumed that they're put there by extraterrestrial because they seem to have a level of technology that we're not familiar with. But could they be military implants?
Well, this is the sort of implication that that comes up. Dr. Roger Leir is sadly again no longer with us, and I think there is something in this. I think there is some relationship between what Dr. Roger Leir found and what William Pauleck talked about, which was the implantable chip technology that he was developing in the 1970s. So the idea of alien implants and these sort of alien abduction experiences are obviously closely connected. Some abductees say that they've had implants in their, in their ears, in their noses, in the back of their neck, in their legs, in their wrists, and this sort of thing. And I know you yourself, Richard, you did a program, didn't you, a few years ago now, with this one that was investigated by, I think, Manchester University, this object that was taken out. So again, people can revisit that in the context of this. And I think Roger Leir, again, had done his own investigations.
So she says that every one of the women, this is the abductees, have reported seeing other humans present in abduction situations. Amy, Angie, Lisa, Pat and Beth recall experiences that involved military personnel, and in most instances there were aliens working with humans. Although some of these scenes may have been alien VRS productions, VRS?
That's a virtual reality system.
Right, which you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Other peripheral activities do indicate actual human involvement. Angie, for instance, was confronted and intimidated by uniformed men in the pickups that pinned her between them on the highway. Just hours before, she had a military abduction and was threatened about talking. So let's go down the line that many of these abduction experiences are the military and they're fooling the person that it's an alien abduction. What's the reason why they would do that?
Well, you know, then what I wanted to mention, is you reminded me of it there in bringing up this connection, is again, we've got to be careful that we don't assume it's just military or it's just aliens or it's just all an hallucination. What I also look at in the book is the accounts of the alleged meetings between Eisenhower and aliens which took place in the 1950s. And there's some research by Art Campbell, who identified several witnesses to Eisenhower going to Holloman Air Force Base in one meeting, and there was another meeting that he went to another Air Force Base, which I think was Edwards. And there was, I think, one meeting was in the 1950s, and I think there was another alleged one in the 1970s. And there was also, I think, another one which took place at Holloman Air Force Base. And so these stories have come out over the years, but if you read the Art Campbell research and listen to the videos he's made, and you listen to, for example, to Paul Shartle, who said that he had actually seen a film of aliens landing at an Air Force base, getting out, going into a building and meeting with Air Force officers. And I go in a bit more detail in the book. You know, you can certainly ask the question. And based on, for example, the testimony of Stephen Lufkin, who apparently was in on meetings with Eisenhower where they were talking about flying saucers and aliens in the 50s, and Eisenhower was very concerned, apparently according to Lufkin and other people, about the UFO issue. Lufkin makes this comment about how the future, plans were unfolding. And Eisenhower said in a meeting, apparently, that the future and the control of the future was not going to be in the best hands. And this seemed to be in relation to what was happening with the military-industrial complex. Mm. But one can also surmise, and Lufkin certainly doesn't say this, but I'm in the book I sort of allude to this, and maybe I'm putting two and two together and getting five. But is it indeed true that Eisenhower, and this is what Bill Cooper said as well, he said this in the 1989 video that I referenced earlier regarding the Steven Spielberg E.T. thing. Cooper alleges that Eisenhower did meet with the aliens. He made an agreement to exchange technology and that the aliens were going to be allowed to abduct humans. Mm-hmm. And one can therefore surmise that maybe that agreement got extended in that the aliens were abducting humans, but the military were assisting them in whatever way. And so what Carla Turner describes is correct in that military personnel were present at some of the abductions, but the aliens were involved in some of them too. And according to what Cooper says about Eisenhower, one of the parts of the agreement is that we would agree, or the humans would agree, Eisenhower would agree, to keep the aliens' presence a secret, mm-hmm. which then it all explains why we've got part of the cover-up. So if you can accept this amazing idea that Eisenhower actually met with aliens in the 50s, it kind of does actually, to my way of looking at it, explain a lot of what's gone on with the abduction scenario, and to some extent the cattle mutilations as well. And
you've explored the evidence for the claim that Eisenhower met with aliens.
Correct.
And you think a good case can be presented?
I think a fairly good case can be presented that has happened on more than one occasion. Right. Yes, it is my conclusion. I could be wrong, but that I think fits quite well with the way that the abduction cases seem to have unfolded since the 1950s. The first case that we can point out, of course, is the Betty and Barney Hill case, right, which was a change from the 1950s Space Brother type, George Adamski, George Van Tassel, and several other, Space Brothers coming to help us. The Betty and Barney Hill case in '61 was a big switch away from that type of scenario.
Right. And you mentioned mutilations there, so we'll come on to that, which are often linked to the Dulce base, the deep underground military base. And you quote from the Valdez book. So this is the son of a police officer who investigated the cattle mutilations and what was going on at the Archuleta Mesa area, where there is a base there, That's not denied, is it?
Correct.
The Dulce base.
Right, and so if it's worth mentioning a little bit, spend 5 minutes or so on the Dulce base story, which I go into in that book, and I recommend that anyone reads the Greg Valdez book. And when we did one of your events at in the last tour, I did mention that to somebody in the audience who asked a question. There is this book, as you say, by Greg Valdez, who's the son of Gabe Valdez, and he was actually one of the police officers that was, responsible for investigating crimes in the Dulce area in the 1970s, between the 1970s and the late 1990s, early 2000s. And Greg Valdez is his son, and he was actually going to the site of mutilated cattle when he was like 10, 12, 13 years old, and he was seeing these things firsthand. And his father, Gabe Valdez, died, I think, in 2011, and he says that his father was a hoarder. He used to hoard all these files, so he'd investigate all these cases, and he had a garage full of files that Greg Valdez then went through and wrote the book, which is called Dulce Base. And as I say, you can read that. I recommend that people read that who are interested in the Dulce Base story. And just as a couple of examples, he said that his father, Gabe Valdez, investigated Phil Snyder, and he did background checks on Phil Snyder. And he came to the conclusion that Phil Snyder's story almost certainly wasn't true. And the whole Dulce base story being a base where, they've got parts of humans stored and, these nightmare halls and all that. A lot of that came out of an abductee, an alleged abductee, who was fed to Gabe Valdez as a possible witness to this secret alien base. And he was given that witness by, I think, somebody connected to Richard Doty, who's this disinformer that Stephen Greer is now recently been promoting, actually, which is quite interesting. And so that whole Dulce base story came out of the Paul Benowitz case, and it appears to be basically, if you read the Valdez book, a whole sort of fabric of Air Force disinformation. And
I'll give a summary of the conclusions, because you think that there was a couple of secret military projects going on at the Dulce base. Benowitz started to find out about them. He put 2 and 2 together, made 5, and thought they might be UFO related. The Air Force got to know about him, so they then fed him disinformation to steer him away from the true purpose of that base. So let me just read this. Valdez illustrates, based on evidence collected by his father over many years, that an advanced type of aircraft was being used to visit cattle and remove and return the carcasses. This clandestine work was part of at least 2 other programs related to checking for radiation contamination in animal tissue in the area. As implied earlier, Valdez also hints that secret bio-warfare research was being done, and the cattle mutilations were probably somehow related to these experiments, which involved the use of some form of anthrax. So Valdez is suggesting that the animal mutilations, at least connected to Dulce, were probably being done by the military.
yes.
Do you go along with that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think in that regard, again, maybe there were aliens involved in the same way that I've alluded to the fact that they might have been involved because of agreements made with Eisenhower. So that may factor into the Dulce case as well. But what Greg Valdez points out is that they found evidence of an underground base, but not quite in the place that the Phil Snyder stories say. There's the Archuleta Mountain and the Archuleta Mesa, and they actually went there, and I think there's a photograph in the book of a vent coming out of the ground, which is suggestive of an underground base. And there are these mysterious towers as well, which are supposed to be lookout towers, but they looked into that, and that doesn't stack up, and they found that who owned this land, that was rather suspicious. And they came to the conclusion that there is a Dulce base, but it's an off-site laboratory for, you've guessed it, Los Alamos National Laboratories. It's an off-site laboratory for them, and it does have a secret entrance that the aircraft can fly into, because that's been witnessed, and they think they more or less worked out where the entrance might be, although they couldn't get to it. And that is all discussed in Greg Valdez's book. So in other words, he doesn't say there is no Dulce base. He says there is a Dulce base, but again, it's probably where secret technology and secret programs are being worked on, rather than it being a base where, you know, alien abductees are taken to and having fetuses removed and these sort of things. Those are exaggerated claims.
Right, so you mentioned Phil Schneider, and I've featured his clip numerous times. It is quite an incredible clip to watch. He was an engineer, or he would be involved in creating underground spaces, blasting out areas underground to be used as bases. And there's this famous clip of him where he's clearly got fingers missing off his hand, and he says that they dug this shaft. And I think you're talking 2 miles underground, so he claims, and there someone comes down in a basket, and they'd gone into an E.T. base where there'd already been a confrontation, and there was a standoff in the base, but they hadn't told him this, and his team then built this shaft, and he went down, and he actually was confronted by a grey alien that shot his hand off,
that's right.
and he was in hospital for quite some period. So is there an alternative explanation then for how he got all of his fingers blown off, and because he had injuries on his body as well?
Again, we've got to be careful. I mean, we don't know how those fingers being blown off were caused. It could have been some other type of industrial injury. All I can tell you is what Gabe Valdez came to the conclusion that Phil Schneider was in a lot of debt, and I think he basically implies that he was telling stories.
Right.
You know. His injury could be genuine, but he said that he couldn't substantiate the claims that Phil Schneider had made in relation to the Dulce base. That was essentially is what Gabe Valdez said. That you know, I don't think he went any further than that. And he did background checks on Phil Schneider, and he found that there were some unusual things in his background that, you know, led him to believe that he wasn't telling the truth in relation to the Dulce base story that he was telling.
We'll add Phil Schneider to the list of people we want analysed by Peter Hyatt, and it is growing by the minute.
Yes.
Okay, now let's just, before we move on, mention mutilations again, because if you want to watch a recent lecture that I gave on the subject of animal mutilations, where I called it an objective study of the animal mutilation phenomenon, and I wasn't confident in that lecture to come down on, well, who's responsible? This is the big question mark of the mutilation issue. Who's responsible? So he's concluding that it's those in that specific area,
yes,
is human beings.
Most likely.
Right. But when you look at some of the evidence for other mutilation cases, and it's if you go to my site, because they're happening all the time over a very wide area on the earth. They're not just happening near a military base, right? They're happening all over the place, in Argentina and everywhere, right? UK. Is it a possibility that the military or some other hidden group?
Well, you know, I think I mainly focus on that in relation to the Dulce case and the conclusions that they came to based on their investigation of the site. For example, one case, they found gas masks next to the carcass. That was in the 70s. In another case, they found this unusual sphere, which there's a picture of in the book, which they state is a non-lethal weapon, and apparently Greg Valdez did some research into this, and it's a type of non-lethal weapon, but it looks like it could be some type of advanced sort of non-lethal weapon that they were using. And we had this conversation, I think, before your lecture about this carcass where there appeared to be something moving around inside it, and you talked about that, and you played that clip of the police officer that was in there, you know, while it was going on, didn't you, from Linda Moulton Howe's interview. And so again, we should be careful of saying, yes, well, all the mutilations are done by people at Los Alamos labs. Maybe they're doing some, maybe there are groups of aliens doing their own abductions and mutilations completely separate or in a coordinated program. You know, I think all that Greg Valdez says in his book is that's the conclusion that we came to as regards the mutilations that were going on in this area. I don't think he broadens that out to the rest of the world where other, circumstances might be slightly different, and other agencies may well be at work, and I don't know.
All right, well, let's come on to a whole other issue, which is the ancient astronaut, ancient aliens, ancient civilizations. There's a lot of TV programs being made, the ancient alien series. I think it's first to point out that the ancient monuments and other artifacts clearly show that people in the past, previous civilizations, were far more advanced than anyone gives them credit for.
I agree.
But the question then arises is, well, were they helped with technology from a non-human intelligence, or was it all part of the human progression? Let's mention Carl Sagan, right? Because I wasn't aware of this quote. Because what you do in the Ancient Aliens section in your book, you look at 3 researchers and you go into quite a lot of detail on each one. So that's, name them for us first.
Well, it was obviously the Zecharia Sitchin. I went through the 12th Planet book and specifically did quite a detailed study of that. So that was the first one. And the second one is Robert Temple, who wrote the Sirius Mystery. So those are the 2 main ones. I can't think of the third.
And then von Daniken.
Oh yes, I didn't do much on von Daniken. I started off with von Daniken, but I just have literally a page on him, essentially because he seemed to be the first person who really kicked off this idea of the ancient aliens.
But before him,
correct,
before he's written his first book, which I didn't know, this is Carl Sagan. Now, Carl Sagan is a mainstream entity, or was. So he's is he a cosmologist?
He was, an astronomer, basically, or an astrophysicist, you might say.
Right, who presented many TV programs, very famous, and I think he died, I don't know when he died.
Early 90s, I think he died, yeah.
Right, but he's someone who was a bit like a latter-day Brian Cox, yeah. So he was making programs explaining about how the universe is, according to science. And some of those programs are very interesting. I remember watching them as a teenager, probably. But there's this quote that I wasn't aware of in a book that he's written, Sagan and
Shklovsky, I say.
Shklovsky, 1966, entitled "Intelligent Life in the Universe." So he says, taken at face value, the legend suggests that contact occurred between human beings and non-human civilization of immense powers on the shores of the Persian Gulf. We were talking about that in a previous show, weren't we?
Yes.
Perhaps near the site of the ancient Sumerian city of Eridu, and in the 4th millennium. I presume that's the 4th, it has to be the 4th millennium BC.
Yeah.
So before Temple, before von Daniken, before Sitchin, we have Carl Sagan laying out the idea of ancient extraterrestrial contact. I can't help find this fact intensely interesting. So that's Andrew's quote there.
Yeah, that's my quote, yeah.
So as I said, you mentioned the 3 researchers. Obviously, there are a lot more in this field.
Yeah. I mentioned some of them in brief as well, just in passing, but those,
Right, so I'll try and characterise them as you've sort of portrayed them in your book. So this is the impression that I got. You think that von Daniken made some very good points, but overstated his conclusions and was too, let's say, colourful and populist, not scientific enough in his approach.
Right.
But not deliberately trying to deceive anyone. You think that Robert Temple's work on Sirius and the Dogon, and also the Egyptian links to Sirius, is very important and provides good evidence of an ancient alien civilization. And Sitchin, you're a lot more critical of Sitchin. You actually think that Sitchin may have been deliberately putting out some disinformation. Right. So it's a mix. So you've deliberately chosen, you know, you've chosen probably the most famous one, Sitchin, that you're very critical of. We'll go through why. But Temple is far less well known, is he not?
Yes, I would agree.
And
yeah.
you think he's way more important?
I think he's probably more important than Sitchin, or at least as important as Sitchin's work, definitely, yeah.
So here's another quote from Andrew's book. He says, "I think that Temple has shown that there is strong evidence that a race of amphibious beings from the Sirius star system interacted with human beings at least 5,000 years ago. Echoes of this knowledge survive in modern cultures and religions." So do you want to talk about the Dogon tribe in North Africa, Northwest Africa?
Yes.
So just tell us about that, Andrew.
Yes, well, they were actually first contacted by French anthropologists I think in the 1960s. Again, I can't remember the exact dates. And then Robert Temple came to this story, and interestingly, he was pointed in the direction of this story by Arthur Young, who was the creator of the Bell helicopter. So that in itself is kind of interesting. And so what unfolded in that investigation was that the Dogon had knowledge of an invisible star, which is known as Sirius B. And they know, for example, that it orbits around Sirius A, I think in, I forget all the figures, I think in 50 years.
50 years.
50 years, that's right, yeah. For either 49.85 years or something, or 50 years. So they know that this invisible star, which was only discovered by modern astronomers in 1977 because of its proximity to Sirius A, which is a very bright, I think it's magnitude minus 2.6, if I remember my astronomy correctly, star. And because Sirius A is so bright, it was very difficult to resolve this Sirius B star in a telescope until the technology got good enough. But this guy eventually achieved it in '77. But they knew its orbit. They say it's a very dense type of material, and it's thought to be a particular type of dwarf star, this Sirius B. They knew the shape of its orbit and its relationship to its companion star. And their culture revolves around this idea that a race of beings called the Nommo came to the Earth from Sirius B, however many thousand years ago, and they gave us civilization. They helped set up civilization on the Earth,
right.
And that's their mythology, and that's built into their rituals. It's built into their culture, which they've been practicing, I think, for at least 1,000 years, if not longer. Right.
So, other than knowing about this Sirius star, I've got a list here of other things that are in there. Well, it was passed down orally, yeah?
Yes.
So they know that this is the Dogon tribe of Northwest Africa, dating back to millennia. Saturn has rings, which are not visible without a telescope. Jupiter has moons, and they have a depiction appearing to show them. Stars and planets move in different ways. Sirius has an invisible companion star called Digitaria.
Yep, which is their name for Sirius B.
Right, which has a 50-year orbit, as you said, around the main star. The shape of the orbit is an ellipse, egg shape, they describe it as. Digitaria, which we call Sirius B, is a dark and a heavy star. The stars rotate on their own axis. Our solar system is part of the Milky Way, so they knew that. Blood circulates in the body. They use this analogy in their description of stars, etc. Sirius, in chapter 2 of his book, this is Temple, begins to explore the significance of Sirius in Egyptian mythology.
Yes.
Which no one seems to dispute.
Right.
So the Dogon are in Northwest Africa. Obviously, Egypt is a bit further east. But you would link them because of Sirius.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, again, this is discussed, I think, in Temple's book, how there might have been a migration either from Egypt to where the Dogon live or the other way round. I can't remember which way round it is, but there's certain mythology to do with, for example, this story of the Argo, the boat, which I think comes into Egyptian mythology, and it got passed into Greek mythology as well. So Temple's book goes into a lot of that and traces where some of this mythology went in history. And the other thing that interested me, because of this, they claim that the Dogon were this aquatic race. I then wondered about this when we talked about this separately before I would put this into the book, about this aquatic ape theory, which was something that Elaine Morgan had talked about in the early 70s, whereby human beings have quite a lot in common with aquatic mammals such as dolphins, such as the fact that the way our sweat glands are, that's very similar to dolphins. The way that our voice box is, more similar to what a dolphin has than what an ape has or what a monkey has. So there's things like that, and I go into that in the book. So I wondered if this idea of, you know, the Anunnaki creating humans that Sitchin had put out, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but I wondered if that actually was something to do with the Nommo, who were this aquatic race, and they'd had a hand in, you know, our DNA being like, having some similarities with what dolphins are like and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So Temple thinks that the Egyptian and Sumerian cultures are linked.
Yes.
So let me just read this, go back a step, I'll read a little bit from Temple. The heliacal rising of Sirius was so important to the ancient Egyptians that gigantic temples were constructed with their main aisles oriented precisely towards the spot on the horizon where Sirius would appear on the expected morning. So let me just, does that not change due to the precession of the equinoxes?
Well, I mean, you know, the way where Sirius appears in the sky will be relative to where the sun appears in the sky or whatever, or will be the same. You know, it will follow the same, because the relative motion of the Earth and Sirius won't change that much in 5,000 years. You know, it will change more over time. But
right. Well, it makes a whole circle every 26,000 years.
Yeah, that's right.
So in 5,000 years it would. So he's all right. Okay. So he's maybe saying, well, Sirius was there when they built it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
I understand.
Yeah.
The light of Sirius would be channeled along the corridor due to the precise orientation to flood the altar in the inner sanctum as if a pinpointed spotlight had been switched on. This shaft of light focused from a single star was possible because of the orientation being so incredibly precise, and because the temple would be otherwise in total darkness within. In a huge, utterly dark temple, the light from one star focused solely on the altar must have made quite an impact on those present. In this way, the presence of the star was made to manifest within the temple. One such temple to the star Sirius was the temple of Isis in Dendera. Yeah. So that's going to a lot of trouble to do that in their temple. So it's obviously very important to them. That
would seem, and that's the argument that Temple makes. You know, so it is very interesting
about their temples. So tell us how he links the Egyptian culture to the Sumerian cultures.
Well, that, I mean, again, comes from things like having an organised system of writing, and Sitchin, you know, goes into more about how the Babylonian myths and some of their mythology, you know, got transferred into the Egyptian mythologies. That more comes from Sitchin. But I don't go into a lot of detail about that.
Right.
Just to try and illustrate, that there is this connection between the Egyptian civilization and the Sumerians, and so, you know, we can make a case that some of these practices of the Egyptians were perhaps connected to the influence of an extraterrestrial race that had come from Sirius, which is where, you know, the Dogon say they came from. That's essentially all that I'm saying from that.
And the Dogons describe the landing of a large craft or ship.
Yes, they do. Yeah, yeah. And it was full of water.
And there's actually a picture of it.
Yeah, I believe there is. Yeah, yeah.
So it was full of water.
Yeah.
So you think that there may have been aquatic or semi-aquatic beings that came to the Earth, which has given rise to this fish god theories or fish god pictures.
Right. And I mentioned a couple of those in the book because, you know, just to mention that briefly, the papal hat, that is in the shape of a fish's mouth. You know, that's clear. So you have to ask yourself where that symbology comes from.
So in Zecharia Sitchin's books, he claims it was the Anunnaki that came here, which are described as powerful humans, super intelligent humans, not fish-based. But you don't accept any of the Planet X side to Sitchin's work. You think that that's not right. So that there's not this 3,600 year planet going around our sun, and that's where the Anunnaki came from. So are you suggesting that there was an Anunnaki and they came from Sirius, or what's your feeling on that?
Well, I think that what Sitchin has put out about the origin of the Anunnaki may not be true. They did, if there was a race called the Anunnaki, they didn't necessarily come from Nibiru. And if you look at the the actual literature analysis, and there's a skeptic called Dr. Mike Heiser, who I quote in the book. He breaks down some of the way that Sitchin uses certain translations, and it's questionable how Sitchin has used some of these. And one of those is about this idea that Sitchin got that the Anunnaki came from Nibiru. In other words, Mike Heiser points out that yes, Nibiru may be mentioned in the scripture, and yes, the Anunnaki are mentioned in the scripture, but there's nothing in the scripture which says that the Anunnaki came from Nibiru. That's Sitchin that's made that connection, if you see what I mean.
Right.
So that's the disinformation that Sitchin has put out, is that the Anunnaki came from Nibiru according to the scripture. It doesn't say that. And in fact, if you read what the scholars say, they think that Nibiru is probably Jupiter in the literature. It's not this planet that comes in. If you look at the orbit that Sitchin claims for this planet, and you look at the orbital mechanics, it doesn't work. You wouldn't have, if the planet was in the orbit that Sitchin claimed, it would fly out of the solar system. It wouldn't be a stable orbit.
Right.
You could make an argument that back in 5,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, whenever it was, a planet could have come into the solar system then, and some aliens could have lifted off from the planet and come to the Earth, and the planet's just drifted through the solar system. Now it's gone. We don't know. We don't have records like that going that far back. But there's no evidence of Planet X in the solar system that's of any size. Certainly not the size that Sitchin describes it in the book. And I think we did cover that in another program. You would be able to see it. If it was in that orbit with the instruments that we've got now, would be sufficient to be able to see this planet quite a long way out if it was the size that and the character that Sitchin claims in his book.
So just staying on the Anunnaki then. So a skeptic would what do they suggest is the origin of the Anunnaki? That they're just a fictional god?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at all what the theologians and the scholars say, it's just mythology. They don't try and attempt to explain where the Anunnaki came from, because they're just in the mythology of the various cultures, the Babylonian cultures and so forth of the time. So they don't attempt to explain where they really came from.
Right. So you think that the Anunnaki might be an advanced race which doesn't originate from Earth, which is spoken about by the Sumerians. They're just not from Planet X.
Correct. Correct.
All right. So is it possible that they were from Sirius, or do you think that's just?
Well, maybe it is. I mean, maybe Sitchin put out this Nibiru story to try and cover up the fact that actually they weren't from Nibiru. They were, had some connection to this Dogon, and they had some connection with Sirius, perhaps. I don't think there's a strong case for that exactly, but looking at the way that disinformation works, we can imagine that if they didn't want us to know that a race of beings came from Sirius B, they might want to change that and put out that they came from this imaginary planet called Nibiru, which we can more or less prove doesn't exist. So that would be a good bit of disinformation to put out about that story.
Right. So let's stick to the human origins side of it now, because you go through that in your book, and if that subject is new to you, it might come as a huge surprise, because evolution is, well, it's still considered a theory, but it's taught in schools as the accepted theory, the accepted science, if you like. But you and I don't buy it, and we think there's a lot more to human origins than what we're told in regular science books. Well, they're not science books. In regular education, let's say. obviously Lloyd Pye wrote a lot about this, and
you interviewed him as well, so
I
people can go
interviewed
back,
him, yeah.
watch the interviews.
I'd planned to interview him just before he died.
Yeah.
So I had 3 lengthy interviews planned with him, which covers a lot of this.
Yeah.
I've still got the interview plans, but he wasn't well enough to be able to do those interviews. Maybe, Andrew, I'll dig those interview plans out and I'll interview you instead. It goes through his, a lot of it's from his latest book.
We could go through that, yeah.
So you mentioned the aquatic ape. So there's a table in your book which looks at some of the characteristics of aquatic, is it mammals?
Mammals, aquatic mammals.
Aquatic mammals and Homo sapiens, and then compares that with apes.
Right.
And I've seen the same thing done with pigs as well.
Yes, yes.
And, well, just, you give it, I'm not going to try and summarise it, you do it.
Yeah, so again, if you compare certain characteristics, and I'll maybe just go through the list, I'll just find it, Richard, bear with me a second. So, yes, we've got this comparison between characteristics of humans, apes and aquatic mammals, and with apes, they don't have a loss of body hair particularly, but we have a loss of body hair, and so do marine mammals. We have skin bonded fat deposits, and so do marine mammals, but apes don't. And there's eccrine thermoregulation, which is the ability to sweat. We have that, and so do marine mammals, but apes don't have that. And reduction in size of sweat glands, that's another factor. And enlarged sebaceous glands, marine mammals have that as well. Psychic tears, we have that, and so do marine mammals. Loss of whiskers, we have that, and so do mammals. This is a big one. Volitional breath control, we have that, and so do marine mammals. They can voluntarily hold their breath so that they can dive under the water. We have a descended larynx, so do marine animals.
So no other primate can deliberately hold their breath?
Nope.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there are several factors like that, and that's discussed in Elaine Morgan's book or on her website, which there's been strenuous efforts to debunk some of that. So I think that's important enough to for people to investigate that. And then, as you've pointed out there, we have, I think, I can't remember his first name, Dr. McCarthy, where he looked at how similar we are to pigs. Yeah, it is Eugene McCarthy. And he'd looked at the genetic similarities between humans and pigs, because again, there's some crossover between those factors that I mentioned there and pigs. And we all know that humans can have pig heart valves, for example. In some operations, they're given pig heart valves and other things. And pigs are very intelligent. But the interesting thing is, which is where I think it may tie in with what Sitchin wrote about, is that pigs, the first evidence of having domesticated pigs, comes from around Turkey, which is quite near to ancient Sumeria, from about, I think, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, which ties in exactly with when the Sumerian culture started. And Lloyd Pye talks about the development of agriculture. So is it the case that pigs were, the wild pigs were genetically engineered to produce domesticated pigs by the Anunnaki, or, maybe it was the Dogon tribe or their associates, and this was then given to the human population to turn them from hunter-gatherers into, a culture which lived in one place, and then, you had to have laws and cities and governing bodies and this sort of thing, which is what the Sumerians, they were the first civilization anywhere that's recognised to have all those things, to have a system of writing and stuff. And that all came, coincidentally, around the same time as the domestication of pigs and sheep and cattle.
So there's an argument that the domesticated farm animals that live alongside man and provide food, what have you, could have been either brought here or engineered here.
Engineered here, yeah. And that actually comes out, because I went back to the original translations of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the the Enuma Elish, which is what Sitchin wrote about. And I found some original translations, not from Sitchin's book, but there are several translations online. And I studied those, and I think, yes, there is evidence in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish, which suggests that there are these other beings coming from outside, as Lloyd Pye has said, and helping to create organised human culture and civilization.
When I interviewed Lloyd Pye, he explained the second and third chromosome evidence, which I found very compelling.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
The fact that we have one less chromosome than all other higher primates, and if you examine it, it looks like the second and third stitched together. And he says that you can't do that. That can't happen in nature. It has to be engineered.
Yeah.
There's that evidence, and then there's just the physical evidence of our genome showing very clearly that the second and third chromosome in humans that is in primates has been fused. I mean, genetically fused, so that its telomeres on its ends are cut off of the second and the third, and they've been put together in such a way that they still function. And that's extremely unlikely to have occurred naturally. Now, science says yes, it does, but really it doesn't.
Because human beings have 46 chromosomes, all other primates have 48. Am I right on that?
Well, the higher primates, yeah,
higher
not the
primates.
lower primates.
So if we've evolved from them, then at some point we would have dropped or fused those. So you would presume, if you go by the theory of this link, that was when the chromosome must have been dropped.
Exactly. When the two chromosomes were fused, it would be in the time leading up to the actual creation of human beings as we are today, yes.
So there's evidence in the human genome that there's been engineering by someone.
Yeah, and Lloyd Pye does cover that quite thoroughly, and it's worth investigating that in parallel with what I've just spoken about.
Yeah, so the question arises, well, who did it?
Who did it? Which agency was responsible? Yeah, yeah.
One of the chapters you call Alien Races and Alien Faces, because there are many claims that people who've either seen or photographed an alien, but you think there are a small number that show strong evidence that this may be a real picture of a non-human intelligence, an entity from somewhere else, right? Yeah. So we're going to look at them now. So one of them is the Filiberto Capone's 1993 Close Encounters photograph.
Right, and this was investigated by Tim Good in one of his books. I can't remember which one. I do mention it in my book. And again, it's one of those stories where you think there's something slightly odd about it, but you look at the pictures and, those pictures are quite odd. But the odd thing about the story is that this little creature, which I think was meant to have been about 3 feet high, and it does sort of very superficially look like a grey alien, very superficially, but its head and its body are a different shape, and it's got kind of stubby arms and stubby legs. And it appears to have these pipes coming out of its body as if it's been hooked up to something to help it breathe or something like that. And it looks like it's injured. It looks like it's got some burn marks on its face or its head. And he claims that this creature, I think this took place in Italy in the early 90s. He claims that he came home from the city one day on his motorbike, and he heard this rustling or something, and he saw this, what looked like a sort of big plastic bag with this creature getting out of it. And he took a photograph then, and then it ran off into the bushes. But then it came back again about over, I think, 2 or 3 visits it had over the next week. And he photographed it again, and on the last day his grandmother saw it as well, and they were interviewed, and the photographs were taken away, and they were published in the Italian media, and he was interviewed, and as I say, Tim Good interviewed him. And you can read the rest of the story in the book.
It's written about extensively in Tim Good's, I think it's Unearthly Disclosure.
Yeah. And so, do go and read those accounts and see what you make of them. To me, I'm not putting my hand on my heart and saying, yeah, this is definitely a picture of a real alien. What I'm saying is that the story seems to be legit. The pictures do look real, or they have a real look about them. And if he faked them, again, he didn't seem to gain anything by faking them. and I couldn't see a motive for him faking them.
Could it be just a genetics experiment?
It could be. It may not be an alien. It may be some type of escaped genetic experiment from some underground laboratory. You know, I really don't know.
All right, then let's consider another one, which is the Amoko alien. Tell us about
So this is again is a story told by Bill Cooper, where around the time that the Bob Lazar story came out, and that had sort of reinvigorated a lot of the interest in the UFO, issue. Amoco published this article, or this advert, I should say, in Aviation Weekly. I think it was 1989 and 88. And it was of this picture saying we have really advanced technology, and it's of this, you can show the picture, but it was this alien holding up its left hand, and holding my right, so its left hand, and it was making a comment about how advanced technology, you know, was used by Amoco to do whatever. And Bill Cooper was intrigued by this picture, and he rang them up and said, what was this a picture of? And he got different stories from different people. One story he was told it was a clay model that was about 6 feet high, and the other story that it was about 1 foot high, and it was made out of plastic or something. So he was given different stories, and that made him suspicious. And they spoke to the photographer, and he sent them a sort of 12-inch version of the picture, which they then studied carefully, and they said they could see little hairs on the neck and on the side of the face, and there was moisture around the eyes. So he, according to what Cooper was saying.
This is Aviation Week in Space Technology, November 21st, 1988. Write that down because somebody's going to ask me. November 21st, 1988. You can find it in used bookstores and libraries. Next picture. In which this ad appeared, talking about technology so advanced it will help answer some big questions, and on the facing page, what's there? This picture. On the side of the neck, there's hair growing. We did extensive analysis of this photograph. We rephotographed it, we relit it, we blew it up. We tracked down the photographer who would not tell us what it was he photographed. We asked originally to Amoco for the name of the artist who drew the picture. They said, I'm sorry, we can't reveal the name of the photographer. We found the photographer. He would not tell us what he photographed, but he sent us an 8x10 copy from the original negative, and then we began to work on that as well as with the ones we had photographed out of the magazine. And this is what Amoco told us. They told us several different things. First, they told us that it was a 9-foot-tall bronze statue. Second, they told us it was a 12-foot-tall bronze statue. And third, they told us it was a 9-inch clay statue. When we pressed for more information and became literally obnoxious on the phone, not accepting what they were telling us and wanting to see the original artwork, they refused and hung up on us. So, whereas I cannot say definitely that this is a live alien, I can tell you one thing, it is not a bronze statue. I can also tell you it's not a clay statue. And hair don't grow on the necks of statues. Next. You can see the moisture in the eye, the incredibly small detail in the texture of the skin and whatever this is, and in the eye. Look at the lip. You ever kissed anything like that before? I know a guy that did in the back seat of a Chevy. Next. Look at the incredible detail. I have never seen an artist in my life that was capable of doing this kind of work. But I haven't seen all the artists that there are either. Next. Look at the lines on the neck. Look at the detail on the arm. Next. Look at the hair on the neck. Can you see it? It's kind of hard to see, but it's there. That little fuzzy hair. Look at the lips. Look at the throat, the detail. the wrinkles. Next. Look at the moisture in the nostrils and tell me that's a bronze statue. Look at the moisture in the eyes. Look at the incredible detail in the folds of the eyes. Look at this bag under the eyes. Next. I think they're trying to tell us something. Next.
And so, you know, you have to wonder, was this a kind of disclosure of a real picture that was put out into the press? You know, I don't know, but I certainly, why I quote Cooper is I found that a good proportion of the information he's put out has been pretty reliable. I mean, we've played on your program before his account of 9/11 and him saying that they were going to blame Osama bin Laden for something 3 months before 9/11 happened. We've played that clip. So Cooper, to me, is sort of a fairly reliable source on the many topics that I've encountered him talking about.
I think Dr. Rowney Kilder has that on front of one of her books, or talks about that.
Oh, okay.
I need to check that.
Okay.
This is my last.
What about this individual being here?
This. Who am I? Who am I? I got it from
That photograph. Can you show any further light on that photograph, which first appeared in Aviation Week in Space Technology? Is that correct?
Possible. I got this from a NATO officer, and got permission to have it on my book because this book is written. I wrote it for males. You know, the other books are sort of philosophical also, but this is facts about UFOs, military facts, and people's experiences and.
All right, let's come on to the next one, which you may have seen this video. It's called The Alien Interview. And I would say that all attempts to debunk this video have failed.
I would agree.
And there's some details in your book that I didn't know about. So what I'll do is, perhaps I'll play this video while we're talking about it, so we can put it on the screen. I featured this in one of my lectures years ago.
Yes.
So this came out in 1997, and it's allegedly from an underground base where they've got an extraterrestrial, extraterrestrial biological entity. That is their word. And it's being held at this underground military base. And this is a video of someone trying to communicate with this extraterrestrial, and what happens is, due to perhaps the conditions or the atmosphere that they're trying to contain this alien in, it starts to sort of convulse and has breathing problems. So 2 medics then come in. So there's no sound ever being released with this video, and there are various things that the interviewer is sat there with in the interview situation that. For example, is it a heart monitor?
Yeah, there appears to be some type of what looks like a heart monitor, certainly an oscilloscope with a trace going up, appearing to indicate heartbeat.
Right. So if you can just go through some of the things that you cover in your book, Andrew, in terms of why is there strong evidence that this is a real non-human entity?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things which struck out. I mean, which stuck out to me, which is Victor, who was the guy that brought this video out. If you listen to his commentary, he sounds like a very intelligent and articulate person, and he actually says, he actually invites people to prove that this video is a fake. He says that. He says, come on, I want you to prove that this is fake. You should do this. It's important that you try and prove this a fake. And of course, people will just say it's a Hollywood puppet, end of, move on. And they did say that in the video that was made about this in 1997 by Rocket Pictures. But the actual video itself, what is it of? The video is of an alien coughing. If you're going to fake a video, it's not particularly an interesting thing to fake, is it? An alien coughing and leaning forward. And if you look, when the alien does start to suffer breathing difficulties, the medic comes in, as you said, and he shines a light into the eyes of the alien and around its mouth. And Victor, what he explains is going on is that they're looking for hemorrhaging around the mouth, and the eyes. And so that to me is a plausible explanation. If this is having some type of physiological difficulty with our atmosphere, then yes, maybe it would have problems with breathing. Maybe it would cause hemorrhaging and some kind of bleeding through any blood vessels it might have. So that explanation struck me as plausible. It was Andrew Burlington who's done an analysis of the video. He has this pseudonym of Victor Nevada. And he picked up a few little details about, like, for example, there's actually another figure standing towards the right. And you can actually see, if you look carefully, the outline of this figure. Mm-hmm. And he's apparently observing the interview. And also he points out that they're communicating telepathically, which again goes back to what Wilbert Smith said about mental phenomena in relation to the early research in the 1950s. And so Victor, I think, does say that they're communicating telepathically with the beings, and other people have reported that as well. But he doesn't make a big thing about that. Mm-hmm. So I think that Victor, whoever he is, he doesn't overstate the case. He says, here's the video, this video is genuine. He's fairly, he sticks within certain bounds, that he knows that this was recorded at a certain place. He says how he came to get hold of it was they were transferring it to another archive and he was able to make a copy of it. That sounds plausible. And so, again, he doesn't go beyond what the video shows, and he kind of wants people to understand that it's real, but he doesn't try and, overstate the case.
And who is Andrew Burlington, Andrew?
Andrew Burlington is a UFO researcher who's based somewhere in the south of England. I have communicated with him a little bit on Facebook, and he's been in the local press a couple of times because he's had UFO sightings himself. And he spent quite a few months sort of going over the video frame by frame, and he published some quite lengthy YouTube videos. I think they're still on his channel. He's got a YouTube channel called the Alien Interview Channel. Mm-hmm. And again, if you watch these videos, they're quite long, but you can watch them at double speed and stuff. And I think he does make some good points.
So let's list some of them. He says that eye sockets appear to change shape during coughing and examination by medics. The head moves in response to the medic's action, which, and there's several instances of that, which might not happen if it was just a puppet. Liquid appears to pour from the mouth and nose. The alien's reaction to the torch held by medics. Heart monitor changes in relation to the alien's condition and movement. He states that in a contrast-enhanced version of the video, a military badge can be seen on the arm of the telepath. The arm of the medic goes over the alien's head several times, showing that if it was a puppet, it wasn't operated by strings from above. The medic picks up a wipe or a tissue, then puts this down and picks up something else, suggesting this was not rehearsed and did not involve actors. Military aide, who is seen in deep shadow in the right-hand side, can be seen talking to the telepath as the alien is struggling to breathe. Objects on the table suggest authenticity, as they would not be important in the nature of this video if it was a hoax, and there are no edits or cuts in the video. Burlington suggested that someone make a video to point out the flaws in the original video or his own analysis, but it appears no one has done this.
Yeah, so in other words, I think he makes some valid points which, to my knowledge, haven't been refuted. So if you take the whole thing, I think that is what is claimed to be. It does show evidence that they have interviewed these aliens. They have had telepathic communication with them to extract information. And other witnesses have said this as well, and I think that backs that up.
So this came out in 1997. Do you know when the actual videos are supposed to have been filmed?
Well, according to Victor, it was around that time. He got it out fairly promptly after it was actually made. And I think it was filmed within, I think he says somewhere, if I remember what I've quoted in the book. So that video was filmed, I think, between 1995 and 1997. I don't think he knows the exact date.
All right, so we come now on to actual physical evidence of a possible alien, which is the Lloyd Pye Star Child skull evidence. And viewers can watch the previous show. We have gone into it in a little bit of detail in a few previous Rich Planet shows, and as you describe in the book, that you've spent so many pages actually explaining what the Star Child skull is and when it was discovered and the tests that have been done on it, but you've had to spend twice as long on explaining how it's all been disinformed upon or covered up.
Right.
Right? Like you think there's been a concerted effort to try and debunk the skull.
Yes, and that actually took place after the death of Lloyd Pye. You know, so he was there for 14 years, putting out that research and developing it the best he could.
So,
And then immediately, you know, almost immediately, within a year after he died, the woman that owned it, Melanie Young, that still owns it, published a report debunking the whole thing after 14 years.
so this was a skull that was discovered in a cave in the 1920s?
1930s. It was 1930 in the Chihuahua area of Mexico.
So it's a real bone skull. No one refutes that.
Right.
And it came into the possession, or Lloyd Pye was loaned the skull
He was loaned it,
because he's
exactly.
interested in human origins to try and explain, because it had unusual characteristics.
Correct.
It didn't look like a normal human being. And he spent years and years researching it, trying to get money to do all different types of analysis, genetic analysis and physical analysis, examination, etc., and really you could spend quite a long time to get up to speed on the whole story.
A while. Yeah. I tried to summarise it in the two chapters.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it all boils down to the genetic evidence, which, well, if the genetic report that Lloyd Pye spoke about, which goes into the FOXP2 gene, for example,
Yep.
right? If all that's correct, it means that you're not looking at a human being,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
But that was debunked by this scientist fairly recently, or in a report that was produced, but they didn't actually discuss nuclear DNA.
No. Correct. So I go into that in the book, that they missed out the nuclear DNA, and they basically tried to just rubbish the previous 14 years of research, and they ignored the physical anomalies.
So you wouldn't refute that some of the mitochondrial DNA is consistent with our DNA?
Some of it is, yes, yeah.
Right.
But overall, there are too many inconsistencies, even in the mitochondrial DNA, for
Right.
it to be human.
Right.
You know, according to the latest research that Lloyd posted.
Yeah. There's a large section in the book about UFO disinformers,
Right.
and we could mention Stephen Greer, because he made a film, and in that film was a little entity that they were going to have tests done on. It turned out it was just a fetus,
Right.
right? So the question that you ask in the book is, well, why didn't Stephen Greer put the Star Child skull in his film?
Right. And I point out what Lloyd Pye told me, that when Stephen Greer was at a conference once, he showed him the Star Child skull, and Stephen Greer picked it up and said, "Oh, that's very interesting," and then put it down again. Yeah, you would think.
And a number of people have done that.
Yeah, and Stanton Friedman wouldn't even pick it up, and this is another theme that I go into in the book. The Star Child to me is some of the most compelling physical evidence of some type of alien life form having visited the Earth 900 years ago. That's what all the tests on it have suggested.
Yes.
It's carbon dated twice,
Right, yes.
So you'd think that the UFO research community would be crowdfunding it to the hilt and all this, that and the rest of it. No, that's not what Lloyd Pye experienced.
Yeah. So although this skull was found in a cave in 1930, the age, because it's been dated, carbon dated,
Right.
it's about 900 years old.
Plus or minus 40 years.
Right. So 900 years ago on the Earth, there was a being which
apparently, according to the geneticists, has no connection to the evolutionary line.
Yeah.
And as we take evolution, we've talked about that a little bit, but if we take this idea of evolution just for a minute, that a geneticist currently believes in, it has no connection to the evolutionary line. And he said it was a non-intersecting evolutionary line that the Star Child was.
Because there is a database of all known species on Earth.
Well,
yes?
it's 100 different types of species, apparently, the NIH database that they've now got. It's a complete genome of animals from 100 different species. And then, of course, you've got a sort of baseline of all the DNA from all the animal life forms on Earth, that you can work with. And the Star Child didn't fit in
at all.
Not as much as it should have, based on the similarity of, say, chimpanzees or other humanoid beings.
Right. Okay. And if we just go back to the point we mentioned at the beginning, which is, how do you prove that they're coming from this star system or that star system? Okay, we looked at the Sirius evidence, again, if this skull does not fit into the any genetic lineage of Earth, then, well, then
you're kind of only left with one alternative.
Yeah. But you don't know where.
No, you don't necessarily know where. And I do mention, for example, how the stories of Zeta Reticulum as a a place where the aliens come from, and possibly the Greys. I do make comments on that, and I don't know whether that's where they come from, but that originally came out as a possible location due to Betty and Barney Hill, but I now question that a bit. In other words, where apart from the Sirius link that we've talked about, why we think that's significant, there is evidence to say, in the Dogon culture, why that's significant. But beyond that, all the other stuff, these aliens either come from Andromeda or the Pleiades. They don't come from star 61317.02, which is what I've probably given a random name, but there are stars that are named that, because there's hundreds of millions of stars that have been identified and resolved in modern telescopes, and any one of those could have, a planet orbiting it. So there's no reason that the aliens should come from the Pleiades or come from the Andromeda galaxy, which is the most distant naked eye object at 2.25 million light years. There's no reason why the aliens should come from the constellations which have popular names. That's my point, really.
Right.
I mean, they might do, but they could just as easily come from somewhere which we don't have a nice, tidy name for.
Right, and Sirius is one of the closest star systems.
Yes, that's true. Sirius is only, I think, 6 light years away, so it's relatively close in cosmic terms, if you will.
And do you know if there's any extrasolar planets there?
I don't think any have been identified that I've heard. Certainly that I've heard of. That's a very good question. As far as I'm aware, no extrasolar planets have been identified around Sirius. Now, again, that might be because it is a very, very bright star, and so if they've had problems resolving a whole star, in 1977, maybe now they would have problems resolving a planet because of the brilliance of the main star. It's a very, very bright star. I don't know.
So one of the sections in the book is called Limited Hangouts and Disinformation. So you're highly critical of Dr. Stephen Greer, who's been one of the leading lights in the UFO field since the 1990s. But you think that although he's on one side he's giving talks about UFO disclosure and this kind of thing, you think that he's got another foot in the intelligence community.
Oh, no doubt.
No doubt, you say.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
just
again,
tell us what's his real role and what.
I think some of that comes out in his own book, which is Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, which was written in 2006 and is, by his own words, a semi-autobiographical book. So I suggest you read that. And one of the statements in there that he makes, kind of almost randomly, is that he went to live in Israel for 3 years, but he doesn't say why. So people can make of that what they will. He also has this other statement, which I think is worth reading out. 2006 book. I am a big advocate of people acknowledging and being tolerant of people who are gay and lesbian, because I'm quite certain that it is a natural variant of human existence which is present at the time of birth. The kind of wholesale bigotry that is attached to gender and sexuality will be a thing of the past. It is already, unless you are part of the immoral minority who really do believe gays, lesbians and feminists caused 9/11. That's what he says in his book. So as I've said to other people when I've mentioned that statement, we should do a Peter Hyatt type of statement analysis on that segment from his book and see what he's really saying. Greer has also admitted in another interview that he was given protection by the CIA. And then my main beef with him against all of those things is that he will not discuss 9/11. He will not, and we've talked about this on Rich Planet before, but it's pertinent to mention it again here. He will not say, oh yes, SAIC were involved in the writing of the World Trade Center reports. He won't talk about the Star Child skull. He refused to pick it up. So he's been very selective about what evidence he talks about and the sorts of things that he's promoting in the UFO research community. Right. And this is true of many other researchers. So
I think we should include the quote then. It was a response to a question that he answered when he was asked about Dr. Judy Wood and the directed energy weapon. Can we find that question and his answer.
The question was, there's compelling evidence that not just the towers but the World Trade Center complex was destroyed by perhaps a directed energy weapon, something that was operating on a technology of molecular dissociation that seems to be very much related to what you've been talking about. So that was the question that the Greer was asked. And he says, I've looked at it. You know, I have bigger fish to fry. 9/11 was terrible. We lost 3,000 people. It led to 2 huge wars and trillions of dollars. I will tell you this. I'm not going to get into specifics. And then he talks about this guy called Richard Foch. And then he goes into about false flags and how you go in and you know, if you're creating an emergent...
Yeah, and then he comes back to the directed energy claim at the end of his answer.
He did, and he says, but I've known what you just asked about since it happened. That's what he says at the end of answering this question. My whole security team lit up like you wouldn't believe when that happened. So
I've known what you've talked about since it happened. So we imply from that he knows that it was a directed energy weapon since it happened.
Yeah, but he's never spoken about it in any of his talks.
Right. So if anyone can enlighten us on what Stephen Greer is talking about, what did he know when it happened about directed energy weapons, and why didn't he speak about it?
Yeah, because surely he's been talking about free energy, you know. And the same can be said, I mean, I mentioned Steve Bassett. He won't talk about 9/11. He mentions, Architects and Engineers Group. And Nick Pope, you know, he goes to all these conferences. He thinks that Al-Qaeda did 9/11, you know. So my point in the book is that if you look at the UFO researchers, they should, and even Stanton Friedman, for example, I gave him a copy of Where Did the Towers Go? I wrote to him a year after I'd given him that copy and says, have you read it? No reply. I wrote to him about the Peruvian mummy case, and I got a reply within 10 minutes about that, you know. Sadly, Stanton Friedman's no longer with us, and I did like the guy, but again, it was illustrative of certain researchers being reluctant to talk about the technological aspects of what I think has come out of the UFO secrecy.
If we consider what we discussed in the previous programme, that it looks like Israel has far too much influence over the United States and what it does in its foreign policy and with its weapons, and that Israeli interests may have been operating in 9/11. So the cover-up of the UFOs and this technology, what's Israel's involvement, do you think?
Well, you know, we can only guess. It's not something that comes up in ufology very much. And the only statement really that stood out to me that I've already read out was the Stephen Greer statement about him going to live in Israel for 3 years, or going to stay in Israel for 3 years. So that is very interesting. And, you know, again, we don't have any information about what that might mean. So does Israeli intelligence operate within the UFO community? I don't know. I haven't gone to look for evidence of that, nor have I been shown any specific evidence. But we have to, you know, consider that there may be some influence going on behind the scenes to divert people away from certain areas of research, and then who's doing the diverting, you know.
And perhaps we just finish with a word about disclosure, because really that's a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a flawed term, really. Asking for disclosure, asking, say, the US government for disclosure about UFOs is like asking the mafia to disclose all the details of their previous crimes.
That's a good analogy, yeah, very good analogy.
So you actually speak to the reader in your book and you say that, well, it's not disclosure that you should seek. So tell me.
Yeah, so, you know, I'd just say towards the end that it's discovery. You can discover things for yourself by looking in the nooks and crannies for the evidence and coming to your own conclusion. And you shouldn't really seek any kind of official recognition that your conclusions are valid, because you're not going to get it. You know, you've got to be happy with that in yourself and find the truth for yourself. That's, I suppose, what I came to the conclusion about. Once I'd found out what happened on 9/11, I kind of realised over time that there wasn't going to be any official disclosure, because, as you said, it would involve too many criminals having to confess to their crimes openly in public, and that ain't going to happen with things as with things as they are at the moment.
Well, it's a good point to finish on. Discovery, not disclosure. Believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.